coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
The New York Times had this paragraph in a piece where they said, we've consulted many former McDonald's employees, and they really say Trump didn't know what he was doing at the fry thing. I mean, he put too much salt on thing and then threw salt over his shoulder, saying that you got to do it over the left shoulder because I'm superstitious. And the lack of joy on the left in conducting this campaign and from the Harris campaign compared with Trump just having a grand old time, I think is one of the, you can't quote me on this because how do you prove such a thing? But I think it's a big part of the deflating of the balloon of the Harris-Walz campaign. And I don't care what anybody says. That whole McDonald's thing was just a lot of fun.
Oh, man. They fact-checked his McDonald's shift. It's beautiful. I couldn't have asked for more. It was very short-sighted of them, in retrospect, to make the Kamala thing about joy. Because they were obviously trying to wrest this property away from Trump, who obviously is having a good time, and manufacture it for themselves.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the publisher and editors podcast at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, fresh off a trip to New York. It's why I missed last week. I just want to flag it before I do our normal introductions of our usual suspects, but we presented our Salvatore Prize in the American founding to our chairman, Tom Klingenstein. Now, some of you, maybe those that hate listen to this, will think this is maybe ridiculous, but it's not. Tom has been doing much more over the last decade than merely giving the Claremont Institute money and funding other right-wing causes. I mean, his philanthropy has been very important. It's been a big part of our some of our expanded successes. But more importantly, Tom is a playwright, an increasingly vocal public critic of the left and the stakes of our current constitutional crisis, and is really devoting most of his fortune, I think, in the years he has left. He's not a young man, but no imminent health problems, to trying to save America. That's always been the goal of his philanthropy. And our Salvatore Prize was always dedicated to those who devoted their lives and careers to preserving the American founding and its principles. And his investment in Claremont over the years, including our full teaching program across the fellowships, and then a lot of his other work, especially over the last 8 years or so since Trump was elected, been directed at, disagree with him though you might, what he thinks are the foundations for civic and constitutional health. So it was a fun party in New York, about 160 of us. Vivek Ramaswamy, who's become friends with Tom, delivered special remarks, and I think Vivek has them up. I think he recorded them, but I haven't double checked. And I'll be posting a version of my introduction of Tom. So check all that out, and follow Tom at tomklingenstein.com. They're doing a lot of writing, including a lot of more partisan stuff in the sort of high-minded sense that we just can't do at a place like the American Mind, especially this close to an election, but really at all, because of, we're a nonprofit, so we can't intervene in campaigns. But Tom does not have that problem. So if you want a little more red meat and a little more explicit partisanship, though of the high-toned variety, go to tomklingenstein.com. Had to give a shout out to the chairman. One of the great blessings of Tom's philanthropy at the Institute over the last about 20 years, though he hasn't been chairman quite that long, has been that he's become a good friend to the senior scholars at Claremont and to me as well. So if you don't know Tom, try to get to know him. If you're a Claremont alum, I always tell you, reach out if you're in New York. He loves to talk to alumni. And anyway, with that said, a little long-winded, I'm joined by Mike Sabo, managing editor of The American Mind, and Spencer Clavin, sartorial editor at The American Mind and associate editor at the Claremont Review Books. I sometimes make fun of Spencer because he'll come on the podcast. Right now, ladies and gentlemen, he's wearing a charcoal blazer, a gold chain, and a black T-shirt. It's the Mark Zuckerberg look, I think.
I was going to lobby for Big Mac editor of the American Mind personally, but I like,
Big Mac editor. Oh yeah,
yeah.
that's right.
Well,
Don't get
we're
ahead of
gonna have to.
ourselves. We'll talk.
Sorry, I didn't mean to scoop us, but we'll have to open a fashion section. I'm sure our readership would be thrilled.
Mike Anton would like a word. It'll that'll be the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It'll be Spencer in t-shirt and blazer, and Anton in a Anderson and Shepherd bespoke suit. It'll be great.
Three-piece, exactly. No, the t-shirt and blazer, I'm simply drifting on the winds of fashion here. This is like suddenly everybody started wearing these, and I couldn't.
Yeah.
I'm not like Mike in that Anton has an actual sense of style, so he can be independent and have his own mind about things and assertive. I just like do what everybody else is doing because I'm a sheep.
I will say though that Spencer's dressed better than either me or Mike Sabo at the moment on this podcast. So
Well, it's a
I
low
don't.
bar, fellas. Let's be clear.
All right. Well, I wanted to start with this recent Washington Times piece that's very short. It just flags for everyone the following facts. The Supreme Court agreed Monday to hear disputes against the Environmental Protection Agency and whether challenges to its plans must be brought in D.C. federal court. In Monday's orders, the justices announced they'll hear Oklahoma versus EPA and Pacific Corp versus EPA, which deal with air quality plans surrounding pollution that travels across state borders. Specifically, the justices will review if challenges related to the plan have to be brought in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. The third case, EPA versus Calumet Shreveport Refining, relates to EPA's regulations on oil refineries. It also focuses on if the challenge must be reviewed in D.C. federal court instead of the conservative Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals located in Louisiana. Now, these, maybe they sound like and will probably be kind of technical statutory interpretation cases, but also with constitutional implications. But I want to take them as just representative of what could be a rolling series across multiple terms, started last term, of the kind of chipping away at the administrative state and the retethering of it to founding principles and U.S. constitutionalism and the separation of powers. I think it's Loper Bright last term, which we've talked about, which overturned Chevron deference. And the facts are interesting. It's just the many ways in which our overreaching federal government imposes costs without much accountability and has in recent decades. It was I think they were lobster fishermen, and they basically been saddled with regulators on their boats to make sure that they were conducting their fishing properly. And the agency responsible just imposed on them the requirement that they pay the wages, the daily wages of the inspectors on their boats. Now, when you appeal cases like this in our current regulatory environment, one which we hope is getting more favorable to the rights of citizens against the overreaching feds, you appeal it, you may take 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars before you ever get to a proper Article 3 under the Constitution court. This is part of a larger trend that the Roberts Court has been advancing kind of diligently but incrementally. And I just wanted to use it as an occasion to praise Trump and the Federalist Society, sort of hand in hand. FedSoc has gotten a bad rap in recent years from sort of anti-libertarians. I'll keep it as broad as that, complaining that too many of the kind of judges and justices' recommendations out of FedSoc were folks too concerned with procedure, not enough concerned with substance, not willing enough to overturn longstanding precedent. And I think Leonard Leo's strategy has paid off on a number of fronts that should be close to the heart of any conservative. And so I wanted to just draw our line in the sand. Our old friend Mike Uhlman, who's now dearly departed, a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute and professor at our summer fellowships of many years, himself a veteran of the Reagan administration and then the H.W. Bush transition. Uhlman famously, as retold in Clarence Thomas's autobiography, was the first one to sit Thomas down at a lunch when he was at EEOC and say, "Have you ever thought of being a judge?" And Thomas's famous quote was, "Judge, that's a job for old people." Just channel Thomas's baritone voice and then a laugh, and you get the idea. But luckily, starting with Ullman and then others, Thomas relented, and Ullman was involved actually at the very beginning of the Federal Society with Scalia and others, kind of founding it or planting the seed for the idea of it. And whatever some of our friends on the traditionalist right or anti-libertarian right might, whatever reasons they might have to criticize FedSoc, I think it should be noted and appreciated that this was a long-term strategy with a lot of money devoted to it, raised not only by Leonard Leo, but by others. But I think it's a vindication of Leo, and I think it will continue to be a vindication of this strategy. The Roberts Court and John Roberts himself there are plenty of reasons to criticize Roberts, but it might be the case that this incremental approach on the regulatory state, if conducted over the last 10 years and then 10 years hence, Roberts is not a young man anymore, but he's not that old either, could have many years ahead of him. It's one area where we could see a lot of dividends continue to pay out. And so I just wanted to remind people to keep an eye on this sort of thing. It, of course, drives the left crazy. They hyperventilate about the dismantling of the administrative state because they think it's the replacement of expert policy wonks at agencies doing rational, well-intended work, and the substitution of Congress or the court's judgment to the quote-unquote experts. But that cause and that shift has been at the core of the Claremont Institute's work for a long time. So it's notable, and it's easy to get lost in these kind of mundane cases, but I think the cumulative effect of a lot of these in recent years and then going forward is going to be a great boon to our constitutional order, and a great, in many ways, small, medium, and maybe sometimes even large, a great boon to citizen prosperity and the rights of a free people. So
Yeah, no, I think these cases are a big step. I think there's another case that could possibly even overturn Wicker v. Filburn, that awful 1942 case. So that's, I mean, and that's like a bane of conservative jurisprudence for a long time, especially Federalist Society lawyers and judges. So this is a big deal, like you said. This is a cumulative effect. It's a looking kind of at what conservatism has done kind of over the last 30, 40 years, decades. I know obviously they have gotten a lot of heat for that, but you look at some things like this, you look at what obviously Trump was able to do, putting 3 justices on the Supreme Court. This is, again, I think it can be a big deal. I don't want to kind of oversell it either. Roberts is still the Chief Justice. He's been it since 2005, I think. So it's coming on 20 years here. And so this is another step, I think, in the right direction, kind of taking from the administrative state, really, like Steve Bannon said, deconstructing it and really basing it more on the consent of the governed. So I think this could be a big deal. Well, it's kind of wait and see. Obviously, the court is going to take a lot longer than the legislative branch for all these ideas and new goals and aims to kind of filter through in respect to really deconstructing it, to breaking it down, to returning to the consent of the governed. But I think these are good starts. These are good signs. I mean, certainly we're in a better place than we were, say, 20, 25 years ago, for certain.
Yeah, I really like that the case which kicks all of this off has to do with fishing. And I love it for 2 reasons. One is that it's Loper Bright v. Raimondo, and that will enable me at some point to headline an article on the American Mind, Everybody Loves Raimondo. But the other thing is that if you've spent any time talking about British common law or British history, and you get to the part about Magna Carta, which sort of undergirds a lot of constitutional thought in the West, especially the Anglo-American West, the classic citation that people will make whenever they talk about Magna Carta to demonstrate that this was not just a constitution in the modern sense, but also involved all sorts of minutia that we no longer care about. They'll say things like, well, Magna Carta also, it deals with things like fishing rights off the coast of the English Channel. And in fact, yes, this was a major issue that people were disputing ever since the Norman conquest. The king had parceled out fishing rights and hunting rights, and opening that up to the people more generally was a serious constitutional proposition. And usually this is kind of trotted out as a triviality, as if this were an irrelevant particular that they were dealing with. And isn't it funny that history proceeds along these little minute questions? But of course, that is how this works. You get tangled up in some guy that can't make a living because egghead a million miles away with high abstract theories and ideals about reaching carbon zero or something has to crush him into the ground in order to get tenure. And we now live in a system that is designed by those people. I was listening to a podcast, the Slate Political Gabfest recently, that I'd like to listen in on it because it's the lefty, the far left politics that I don't get in other domains. And one of the hosts was talking about the recent hurricanes and so-called misinformation around the hurricanes, and there has been a fair bit of memery and silliness around the hurricanes, but this has been treated as a grave threat to the republic by the left because it means that there are alternative sources of information besides the experts who want us all to take this to be about climate change. And the host goes, well, the thing is, of course, that reporters, good professional reporters, when there is chaos and uncertainty, what they do is they defer to the experts, which is an amazing statement if you think about kind of how an old newsroom hound would have thought about this just a few decades ago. The notion of a reporter deferring to experts or anybody is antithetical to the cutthroat, tough guy persona that reporters cultivated not too long ago, because American truth finders, be they in the press or elsewhere, are supposed to not take anybody's word for anything, but but actually seek out info for themselves. And the outsourcing of that to bureaucrats, experts, many of whom are politically interested, and many of whom will opine as if they had expertise in areas where their actual training doesn't qualify them at all. I mean, COVID was the height of this, but we've seen it elsewhere. This is a massive structural issue, the heart of which I think is in the courts, or is in the snarling of our system with these agencies that the court has basically blessed as de facto lawmakers, deputy lawmakers, or even primary lawmakers with Chevron deference. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of, this is the sort of thing that you work on by slow degrees, and firebrands and commentators like us can get very impatient with this. I'm guilty of it myself. But when something like this starts to come down the line, you realize, oh, actually, you can work on this stuff for 50, 60, 100 years. And only after several bouts between the king and the barons do you get Magna Carta. So it's important stuff.
Yeah, and Mike mentioned this 1942 case, Wicker v. Filburn. I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with it, but in case you're not, here's the précis on it. So Filburn was a farmer in Ohio, and he was found in violation of the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938, which limited wheat production for entering into commerce. Now, of course, Congress can regulate commerce among the states. That's the language from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And it was long thought that this restricted Congress's power to commerce that actually crossed state lines, that is, was interstate. And this case in 42 kind of blew that open. So as much as a lot of our friends on the right, and they're correct, lament the hole that was blown in the Constitution for the expansion of federal, through which the expansion of federal power flowed by the 14th Amendment, especially equal protection clause on civil rights, but on a lot of other things. There was also this blowing up of the Commerce Clause. And this was the court's reasoning. Filburn was growing wheat in excess of the quotas set by the Agricultural Adjustment Act because they were trying to control prices. So he grew more than that, but he only grew it to feed his livestock on his own property. So he said, what the hell? Congress doesn't have jurisdiction over this. It's not even commerce. I'm just feeding it to livestock. And the court said the following: whether the subject of the regulation in question was production, consumption, or marketing is not material for purposes of deciding the question of federal power before us. Even if appellee's activity be local, and though it may not be regarded as commerce, it may still, whatever its nature, be reached by Congress if it exerts a substantial economic effect on interstate commerce, and this irrespective of whether such effect is what might at some earlier time have been defined as direct or indirect. So that at that point, the Commerce Clause kind of swallows all of Article 1, Section 8, which was traditionally understood to mean Congress has these very specific powers of regulation, and it will be construed by the courts to not have anything beyond these. Now, you can expand them a bit with a necessary and proper clause. This was an old argument going all the way back to the founding between Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison. But this was the real kill shot for constitutionalism, at least in this sense of federal power over commerce. And I had a related thought which came to mind just to remind people. FDR famously tried to pack the court when, after he suffered a series of losses in the 30s, and that was unsuccessful for him. It got shot down and led to him losing a significant number of seats in Congress and the Senate in midterms. But he ended up not having to pack the court because by 1942, he'd replaced enough members to get this radical new interpretation of the Commerce Clause. So I know following the bouncing ball of constitutional precedent is not always that exciting, but it is exciting to consider the extent to which the court may chip away a bit at Wicker v. Filburn. I don't think, Mike, under Roberts's tutelage, they will overturn it. You might have to replace a couple more liberals to do that. And maybe Trump will. We'll see if he wins. Also, this other related thought, and it just offers me the opportunity to flag this excellent short podcast done by Steve Hayward for Powerline. Occasionally Steve does the kind of classic Powerline podcast, which is not their normal weekly 3 whiskey happy hour, which is usually Lucretia, pseudonymous Lucretia, an old Claremont friend, Steve Hayward, and John Yoo talking about con law and other stuff. But he has a nice little extended clip of an old Stan Evans lecture at the Philadelphia Society from the early 2000s, in which Evans just went through some of the things he discovered in researching the Venona papers and others about Soviet infiltration of America. And this brings me to this thought was just sparked by Spencer talking about this view of the left on experts. I want to draw this analogy. So it's worth listening to just because Evans is hilarious. He was a famous wit and a very learned man. He's a series of Stan Evans's laws. Hayward's favorite and my favorite too was he really didn't really like Nixon that much, or the Nixon administration that much, for reasons of limited government. But he famously quipped, "Well, if I'd known they've been doing all this cool stuff like Watergate, I would have been signed on long ago." But Evans talked about, it's probably not a good idea to hire communists into your government, and goes through all these examples of basically the feedback loop that was used to manipulate various cabinet agencies or heads in the 40s, especially the Treasury Department and others, to basically advance the goals and the goals of worldwide communism, and especially the Soviet Union, because you had quote unquote experts abroad advising the government on who to back and who not to back in various conflicts around the world or regime disputes. Should we back this guy because he's Chiang Kai-shek being a famous example? They were successful in persuading U.S. government officials that Chiang Kai-shek was not anti-Japanese enough, not anti-fascist enough, and should be abandoned. And this redounded to the benefit of the Chinese communists. And Stan goes through some other examples. And Steve uses this recent revelation about Iranian infiltration of our government, or the possibility of it, in light of the leak of Israel's war plans to Iran, to raise all this on the foreign policy level. And so you always have this problem of experts. I want to draw the domestic, maybe provocative conclusion or analog, which is that unfortunately a lot of our experts are basically the domestic policy equivalent of foreign agents. That is to say, foreign to the US constitutional order, because they've accepted the revolution in constitutionalism and limited government that was affected by the progressive movement. And so, deference to experts should be roundly rejected on the right. One reason among many is this reason. It's that their incentives, their understanding of American history, their desires for policy and desires for constitutional direction are basically anti-constitutional. So that's kind of a deeper philosophical reason to reject them. And the Steve calls for, and the left would go crazy over it. Steve says, we should revive the congressional committees on internal security. But it would be really awesome if Trump revived a version of that, a congressional committee on internal on the internal security of the Constitution or something, and use it as a wedge to go after basically hostile experts within the government who have this anti-constitutional design. It could be a lot of fun.
And I don't want to get, over the skis, but actually Steve is writing a piece for our If Trump Wins symposium, and he actually talks about that. So that's just a plug for what's coming up. I think that should be published very soon, but he talks about that internal security issue, and he points out, look at what's happening with Iran. I mean, look at what's happening with China. And you have these students, you have these schools that actually the National Association of Scholars has been done a great job at kind of exposing and seeing what's actually going on. The Chinese, basically democracy schools, essentially, that are, essentially filtering people in, looking at what the US is doing, looking internally at everything, and then reporting back to the CCP. So this is a real issue that Steve has talked about, others have talked about, and that is, extremely important just for the security of the United States going forward.
Yeah, of course, there's that same famous phrase, an idea so ridiculous only an academic could believe it. But my dad always tells these stories, about traveling around the country and meeting people who knew that Stalin was a bad guy before the New York Times knew it. And I think about that a lot, actually. I forget which reporter it was, but there was a reporter that won Pulitzer for reporting on how serene and well managed Stalin's Russia was, while there was evidence available.
I think that was Walter Duranty.
Thank you.
Never go full Durante.
No.
Never go full Durant. I mean, this is it, right? It's like there are things that people just I hesitate to be such a jingoist, but like the American people specifically have like a defense mechanism, a kind of immune system that or an alarm system, a tripwire that goes off when elaborately defended nonsense makes its way into the academy. And I think that this is a major dimension of sort of the founder's defense of having some kind of democratic element in the government. It's not, our government's not a democracy. There are many checks and balances, including on majority tyranny. But the sound good sense of your kind of average person, the yeoman farmer, or however you want to describe him, it's very, very easy to start idealizing people, to get this kind of hazy picture in your head of some character out of Steinbeck or something. Except that then you go out and you talk to people and they really are like, the academics are caricatures of themselves, and the people are sort of like in their simple and clear way, often much more right, especially morally, but have a much clearer sense of what's going on. And I think about this. This is really, we're now moving away from the courts, but I think about this with Donald Trump all the time, because there is this pervasive idea that there's some vast unwashed electorate out there who love Donald Trump. They just adore him. They're Trump slaves. They're licking his boots. You read the New Republic and you read these anti-Trump rags, and it's all they picture the Trump voting populace as just like total brain dead idol worshippers. And I've been around in MAGA world. I know that there's like a degree of grift involved, a degree of sort of hero worship, and all of that is true to an extent. But you talk to most Trump voters, and they're so much more clear-eyed than your average, like Atlantic staff writer. Like they're actually quite precise about what Trump's defects are, who they understand the guy to be, why they're voting for him, in a way that Kamala voters really are not. I mean, Kamala voters can be fanatical in a way that Trump voters are always accused of being. And I guess my point here is only that the picture of the world that our supposed thought leaders are, have is so out of whack, so detached from reality, that somewhere, somehow, if we're going to get through this crisis, we need to like clean house utterly. Like we need a total staff turnover in our highest positions. And the Trump election and the court dimension of it, the overturning of the bureaucratic state, are kind of two sides of the same coin in that way.
Yeah. Let's hope we're in for some needed correction on these fronts. Speaking of Trump, we couldn't, of course, have this podcast this week without talking about Trump at McDonald's. Probably most of our listeners have seen this. I don't know if you've all seen the 55-minute clip. I haven't. I've just seen clips, but Trump did the left is trying to shout it down as a ridiculous staged event at a McDonald's in which he worked the fry station and generally had a great time yucking it up with the employees and with the drive-through customers, all of whom were pre-vetted, of course, because you don't want them pulling out a gun and shooting him in the head, as has been tried a couple times now in the last few months. So those of us who understand exactly what this was, and I think most of Trump's voters knew exactly what it was, which was, of course, it's a political stunt. These are a dime a dozen on campaigns. The Kamala team does it all the time. Both sides do it. The restaurant stop in, the Trump went to the Bitcoin bar, but the McDonald's one was particularly charming, I thought, in that, Trump's just riffing it up there, having a great time, cracking jokes, being himself, being normal, being joyful even. And the left is freaking out about it. Meanwhile, they're freaking out as well. I just want to read a few headlines. Here's one from the Bulwark. Will Saleton. Let's be honest, Trump's running as a fascist, in which the content of most of it is confusing, I think. Trump's sort of manner of rhetoric on the campaign trail and his hyperbole, confusing that for concrete plans or evidence of some sort of Hitlerian agenda. I think to be a serious observer of Trump through his presidency and since is to understand the disparity, or it's not, disparity is not the right word, but the difference between how he talks on the trail and what he is likely to do with allies when in an administration. And there's just really no evidence at all from his first 4 years that he has some grand fascist plan. So, while being outraged at these individual pieces of quotes pulled from speeches, may have been or had a little more validity maybe in 2015, it seems kind of ridiculous after his tenure as president. The Atlantic headline is Trump is speaking like Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. Some similar stuff from Anne Applebaum, who really no one should take seriously anymore, but a good data point. And then we were having a lot of fun just running through. So this New Republic piece, which the headline of which is the 100 worst things Trump has done since descending that escalator. I just want to read a few because they're pretty funny. The top of the list, meaning the bottom of the list, 100, shark or electrocution, the eternal debate. A debate he used to share with the public as whether it's preferable to die in the jaws of a shark or get electrocuted. I don't understand why that's so bad. It's just funny.
Yeah, Hitler-esque, obviously.
He fat shamed Chris Christie. Greenland with envy, Trump's plan to buy Greenland, which actually, I mean, it was always sort of a pipe dream, but it would be a pretty excellent strategic victory against advancing the safety of the American people with a wonderful site for a bunch of great missile defense, which would put our minds at ease in light of Iran and North Korea and Russia. But anyway, tells Boy Scouts about a sex party on a yacht. Duncing about architecture. This was about the famous executive order, which a friend of Claremont, Justin Shubo, among others, helped get passed, which would basically, I think it was dubbed, make federal buildings beautiful again. Yeah, actually, that's sorry. It's a great Trump administration detail. The executive order was called "Making Federal Buildings Beautiful Again." They wanted to revive classical architecture in D.C. and elsewhere, and this was denounced as some sort of white supremacist ploy by the left. The biggest, most beautiful terrace, self-explanatory. Woos black voters with a mugshot. That one's pretty good. And then I just want a special shout out to our friend Mike Anton, who made the list, I think, at number 62. Yeah, the Flight 93 presidency, which denounced Mike and his Flight 93 election essay from 2016. We're going to talk about the state of the race a little more explicitly in the next segment, but I think, the McDonald's thing, the freak out about it, the absurd, the New York Times had this paragraph in a piece where they said, We've consulted many former McDonald's employees, and they really say Trump didn't know what he was doing at the fry thing. I mean, he put too much salt on thing and then threw salt over his shoulder, saying that you got to do it over the left shoulder because I'm superstitious. And the lack of joy on the left in conducting this campaign and from the Harris campaign compared with Trump just having a grand old time, I think is one of the you can't quote me on this because how do you prove such a thing? But I think it's a big part of the deflating of the balloon of the Harris Walls campaign. And I don't care what anybody says. That whole McDonald's thing was just a lot of fun.
Oh man, they fact checked his McDonald's shift. It's beautiful. I couldn't have asked for more. It was very short sighted of them in retrospect to make the Kamala thing about joy, because they were obviously trying to wrest this property away from Trump, who obviously is having a good time, and manufacture it for themselves. It's a little bit like trying to create synthetic some sort of like body fluid that you find in your enemy. You try to create it synthetically in a lab, but of course, unless you think that you genuinely can sustain that all the way up to the election, which they were never going to be able to do, you've set up a rubric in which you are at a natural disadvantage against your opponent, Trump, who by definition, like who you chose this rubric because of what he's good at. I mean, it's really an amazingly self-defeating strategy if you think about it. Like, we're going to make the election about the things that Trump is best at, because they thought they could like steal those things from him and wear them as a skin suit. They thought they could like take the kryptonite and steal Superman's powers or whatever. But this is Trump's weird superpower. He comes by it naturally. It's genetic. It's like this is a standard campaign thing, yes, to go and work at some minimum wage job and kind of get a photo op and glad hand a little bit and all that. Trump has added his totally inimitable, irreplaceable Trumpian spin to it, where it's somehow at once a meme and sincere. It's sort of naively childlike in its sincerity while also being incredibly canny in its irony. It's the perfect Trump display of political acumen. And in response, yeah, you get the New Republic. Like, this is all a birtherist scheme to cast aspersions on Kamala Harris's own claims to have worked at McDonald's, for which, in fact, there is no evidence. And my favorite part was, I think it was the New Republic that said he's trying to claim that she never worked there on the basis of no evidence. Now, if you think about that for a second, what's implied there is that Kamala Harris is to be taken at her word. Whatever she says, without any supporting evidence. They found one friend who maybe thinks that she remembers Kamala working at a McDonald's. There's no record of this. And so the burden of proof is on her opponents to prove the negative. Like, how dare you approach Her Majesty with, how dare you impugn her character? How dare you slander her motives without any evidence? I mean, everybody knows the burden of proof is on the person making the claim, which she is. No, I love it. I love every part of it. And I think it's like, maybe even despite how much people are talking about it and despite how insignificant it seems, it might be underestimated as a win. I would put it up there with his visit to the hurricane victims. It's like a very, very.
Yeah, I forget who brought it up, but I think it should be fairly easy to prove just by her pulling up her Social Security payment record. I don't know if that's actually true. It seems true to me. I mean, you can look at that record because, of course, Social Security won't vest in you as a retirement option until you've put in enough full-time hours, and they send you a letter when you've started to vest, so that you start to be eligible for it. I remember getting that letter 15, 17 years ago. Anyway, it's remarkable. I just in the hit piece category, my favorite, I forget who ran it. It may have just been on Twitter, but it wasn't just some rando. But I think it was an article somewhere. It's like, who else staged populist photo ops with pre-vetted proles? Mussolini, and it showed an old picture of Mussolini, out in the fields with farmers. It's I just don't understand who they think the audience for this kind of hyperventilation is, other than their base, which then what's the point? I mean, I guess ginning up your base and your activists is not a terrible strategy, especially if you think you might lose. So I guess it serves a certain purpose, but it's just most normal people, if it even comes across their transom, just seems insane.
Yeah, and I think this is the most important thing that Trump does is he just shames the press. He shames these people constantly, their norms. On the one side, and I'm still trying to figure out how this works, but I mean, the left, they seem to be pretty good at comedy, especially in politics, The Daily Show, long time. But then you have this on the other side where they take them so seriously. I mean, it's like, lawyers reading through some, I don't know, contract with the Soviet Union or something like that, where it's like they're looking at each sentence, each word, each letter with like through a jeweler's eye. So it's just this weird kind of like, I mean, almost like things that are two totally opposite things. But, Trump is just shaming what they do, their whole way of life, this fact checking stuff. I mean, everything. And I think this is absolutely necessary in order to really kind of break people's kind of thoughts or ideas or even linkage to these things that the press has kind of built up to claim some kind of authority. You need to do these things, so this is so important just for that reason alone. And this is also too maybe a more minor point. I mean, this is the same playbook that they've run for a long time. George W. Bush, I think it might have been 2000, maybe 2004. They ran some pieces about, his grandfather may have helped the Nazis in World War II. So every Republican opponent is Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, some Frankenstein monster. I mean, it's just so that's the same old thing. But I think Trump is really the first one to actually be able to fight them on their own territory and really beat them because they do not know how to go after him. They take themselves so seriously. They keep falling into the same traps over and over and over again. The same things that he was able to accomplish in 2016, he's able to accomplish now. And it's like you have the most credentialed, most, smartest elites possible, and they keep just falling for the same stuff over and over and over again. I mean, it's just like Roadrunner, kind of evading everything on his life over and over and over again, and he's able to do it. And Trump just reminds me of that. It's just the same thing. Andrew Beck, our vice president of communications, he had a great tweet. He said, literally Hitler equals a liberal boomer New Yorker who moved right because he is bothered by incompetency and injustice. It's like that's literally Hitler. Trump's immigration plan. Basically, you read Bill Clinton's 1995 State of the Union address, pretty much almost exactly the same thing, literally Hitler. So this shows it's not like Trump's the fascist or Trump's this. It just shows how much the ruling class is just at odds with regular aspects of government, regular just reality itself. So and again, it's important that Trump he needs to keep doing this. Hopefully, when he wins, we'll see. This needs to be a regular part. Who he picks for press secretary. I think the whole Sean Spicer thing about the crowd size in 2017. That was all part and parcel of this. They may have not always picked the right kind of battle, but this is what is always behind that. It's to shame the press, shame these people, and allow somebody like Trump to actually go forth and to show many Americans whose trust in the media is totally declined and totally imploded that no, you are not crazy. You are seeing the truth. It's these people who have led you astray, but you can see reality. So I think that is just so important, and I think he's going to keep doing that.
You're absolutely right, Mike. There's a principle in comedy that is embodied by the episode of The Simpsons in which sideshow Mel, so the murderous clown that wants to kill Bart, it steps on a rake, and the rake sort of swings up and smacks him in the face. And the creators of The Simpsons talked about this as an actual premise that he does it once. It's pretty funny. It happens again. It becomes a running gag. Pretty funny. Later on in the episode, it happens another time. Still kind of funny, but then the fourth time, it's like, okay, this is really a played out joke. But if you keep your foot on the gas and you do it again, and then it happens like 5 more times, you actually run past the dip in hilarity and you end up at a place where it's funny that they're still doing it. And this is true for any gag. Like, you keep up a gag long enough, at a certain point, people get tired of it, and then your insistence upon it becomes its own kind of hilarity. And Trump's derangement of the media, that is the way that he makes them deranged, is like that kind of joke. It's something that the first time it happened, we were all kind of shocked and amused that, wow, this guy really can just say whatever he wants. He'd talk about shooting people on Fifth Avenue and he'll get away with it. And then after a while, it was like, well, but now we've really got him now. Now it's the January 6th and it's the court cases. And we went through a period with him where it was sort of like, oh, actually, this didn't work. You can't do this forever. And then he just kept doing it. And the assassination attempt and like a few things recently that he did not engineer, but the way that he reacts to things too, and the way that he has just this instinctual photo ready persona, and the way that they cannot help themselves but set themselves on fire when they react. It's like it's come back around now, and it's kind of funny again, and at exactly the right moment heading into the election.
I think 2 weeks ago I made the case for why I thought Joe Rogan didn't want Trump on, having to do with his audience and stuff. But now I'm going to steal from someone on Twitter. Forgive me, I don't remember who, but it was sort of making the case for maybe this was 4D chess all along. Rogan was rope-a-doping everybody, and now he's going to have Trump on Friday. And I'm interested to see how long this derails the Harris Walz news cycle. Like, I mean, it could last a week, which is kind of kryptonite right now for them, given the state of the race. And our priors on this state of the race thing is, among others, Mark Halperin, which I think we mentioned 2 weeks ago, also has continued to run these. He's always run for many years now, or at least a couple, these morning briefings where he has, especially election season, and he's been sounding the alarm now for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And his latest thing is he was discussing with Sean Spicer the sort of early vote data that's coming out of Georgia and North Carolina. And Spicer said, "Yeah, I don't want to jinx it, but the GOP folks I'm talking to are pretty much giddy at the Georgia and North Carolina data." And Halperin's quote was, "Look, if this continues, this election night's going to be over maybe even before it starts." Now, there's all sorts of variables across the swing states, right? This could be sort of a relapse from the GOP's wariness of early voting and mail-in voting, but especially mail-in voting in 2020, and now they're overcorrecting. So there really is going to be a red mirage in some of these places, but I doubt it will be much like 2020 in the sense that Trump's in a much better polling position than he was in 2020 or even 2016. This far out, the race is much tighter. It's basically a toss-up by the polls across most of the swing states. I think Nevada may be the worst for Trump, and there's some rumblings that really Georgia is kind of out of reach already. But we'll see. We're not in the election prediction business, and we're not academics on questions of polling and turnout and canvassing and all that. So we don't need to get into that. But I think it's pretty interesting, and it's I just wanted as a callback to our last piece. I did want to pull up this James Carville quote, just one more entry in the freak out. I mean, Carville is an interesting case here because he also has been raising the alarm about Trump and the Harris Walz campaign and the kind of trajectory of the left on issues of culture and the rest for months now. And he's obviously worried about it. But now he's descended like his other fellow Democrats into just kind of madness, which is, uh, was Carville's quote from some podcast. "You better pay attention. And every time you have somebody who's a friend of yours, I won't try the Cajun accent. I'll butcher it. Somebody says, 'Well, I'm going to vote for Trump.' You say, 'Just so you know what you're voting for, do you really want me to go to jail?'" And it's another example of projection. I mean, if any party could be accused of politicizing partisan differences and trying to throw their partisan enemies in jail, it's certainly not the Republican Party. So it's just one more data point, I think, on the possibility that the wheels are coming off the Harris Walz campaign. I mean, still plenty of time left, but you had Obama sort of up in Michigan, kind of scolding his fellow black men for not voting for Kamala, for being wary of Kamala, basically calling them sexist. You had him on this recent podcast trying to get the youth vote out. So these are two data points. They're obviously worried about the young who don't really vote that much, and they're very worried about black voters, which seem to be Kamala seems to be having some slippage from Biden, which is going to be a real problem for them across states like even states in the upper Midwest, certainly Michigan, definitely Pennsylvania. If these slipping numbers pan out, even if they have to pan out, it's going to be in these razor thin swing state margins. It's going to be a big problem. So this was Obama. I just wanted to raise it because it's so ridiculous. We used to say, and this is of course Obama and his like folksy, just with the dudes kind of intonation. We used to say, "Let me get this straight. You're not going to vote, which means you're going to let a bunch of old people decide your future. You wouldn't do that about your music. You wouldn't do that about your clothes, but you're going to let them decide what your future, your potential careers, what the environment's going to look like. You're going to let them decide that. You're just going to opt out. That doesn't make any sense." So that was his pitch to young voters. I mean, among other things, the paralleling of deferring to the old on your clothes or music versus the wisdom of your political choices is just so inane that only ignorant young people would buy it, for one thing. And it's just, just another sign, I think, of some panic buttons being hit at the Democratic HQ.
And even going back to Obama, old people making decisions for you. Okay, so yeah, let's vote for the party of the Democrats. Let's check out their Senate leadership. Chuck Schumer, Dick Durbin, Elizabeth Warren, Mark Warner. I mean, what world exactly is he living in? Like, this is, and Obama himself, this is not 2008 anymore. He's 63 years old. So, I mean, what exactly is he talking about? Like you said, I mean, it's just everything that you say, it's just utter projection from the Democrats. It's just laughable. And really the word that comes to mind with Obama is just lame. I mean, just utterly lame. I don't know who listens to him anymore. You hear him speak, and even like the magic is clearly gone, I think, for the most part. 2008, 2012. It's been a long time ago now. But I think he's still very active behind the scenes. I mean, we'll see if Harris does win. Obama term 4, we'll see. I mean, this other line too, I don't understand how we got so toxic and just so divided and so bitter. It's like, hello. I mean, like, don't you understand what you're doing? Or are you just totally oblivious? Or it's just some 16D, Machiavellianism. I mean, with Obama, you got to almost think it's that because the guy he's too smart. I think he's easily, we can kind of misunderestimate, him or underestimate him just kind of what he knows. The guy's obviously been successful in politics. So you got to almost think, I mean, this is just all kind of by design at the end of the day.
I like your insight here, Mike, that Obama really contradicted himself in that little segment, which is the response from the youth would be, "No, old man, we're not going to take your advice on not deferring to old people about voting.
Right.
We're going to keep enjoying our private pleasures and not worrying about this insane political system. We're not going to vote."
But you guys, he has a podcast with Bob Dylan. He's so cool. Isn't that what the youth, the young people, they like? It is true. I mean, you see all of these public figures whose fame is predicated to some extent on their youth and fashion and being trendy and hip. It slips away from you. Very, very few people stay cool into their old age because coolness is actually a mechanism for keeping old people out. It's people think that coolness is an aesthetic or a property that you can gain, but the reason it's constantly changing is because what it actually is a device that young people use to sequester themselves culturally from older people so that they can have something of their own. And this is actually perfectly healthy. And as you say, Ryan and Mike, it would prompt, I think, most young people listening to Obama to shrug him off just like everybody else. It's just a thing that kids do. It's like a way of social sequestration. But people they labor under the delusion that because when they're a certain age, they're one of the cool kids and they're very good at wielding this particular form of cultural capital. They have some sort of property called cool that will endure with them into old age. And I mean, I'm one to talk. I have a podcast called Young Heretics. And every year that goes by, I think, man, this was a mistake. Like, why'd I call it that? I started out, I was a young, fresh face. Now I'm like getting older every year. And luckily, I began the podcast by saying young heretics is a spirit, not an age or a number. But like for people like Obama, whose major draw was their relaxed, laid back, down with the homies kind of guy vibe, it's very difficult to internalize the fact that you are not cool anymore. But he's not, and I mean, this is exactly the same thing they did with Hillary Clinton. They tried to like swathe her in Obama-dom. They tried to like wrap her in the sheer allure of Barack and Michelle. And if it didn't work then, it's going to work even worse now. We can't predict anything, but things look good, for Trump and for the Republicans, and they look good in ways that are threatening, not just for this Democratic ticket, but for the Democrats generally. I mean, the big question I think is whether Black people, young people, men, whether they're just not that excited about Kamala or whether they're actually flipping from Kamala to Trump, some of them, because that would be the death knell. That would be a real disaster for the coalition that the Dems have run on for a while. But we shall see.
We shall indeed. With that, we can come to a succinct ending about 2.5 minutes early. So I want to thank everyone once again for listening to the Roundtable here at the American Mind and the Claremont Institute. If you want to learn more about our work, go to www.claremont.org and go to that website /donate if you'd like to support our work. We don't sell anything at the Claremont Institute besides a few magazines, as Spencer well knows. So we have to rely on everyone's support to keep the lights on. If you want to see the latest out of our DC Center, go to dc.claremont.org. Of course, visit claremontreviewbooks.com. We have a great new-ish issue up, and we're trying to now put an upcoming issue to bed. But there's a wealth of excellent stuff on there. I want to flag for those Leo sort of political philosophy Straussian nerds out there. If you haven't seen it, there's a great long interview with Harvey Mansfield from Charles Kessler, who was his student 40 years ago at Harvard. And it's charming and interesting, especially if you're interested in political philosophy and the descent of Harvard, because Harvey's been around for all of it. And then also a review by Mike Anton of Harvey Mansfield's new book on Machiavelli. So you can slate your nerd thirst there. And of course, please also go to AmericanMind.org. As always, thank you for listening, and we will talk to you all next week.